One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
I don't think any discussion on inflammation and its role in healthy weight loss is complete without talking about the most common inflammatory triggers. I mean, after all, it's one thing to say I'm going to take some anti-inflammatory compounds, something like, turmeric or resveratrol or boswellia or any of a number of different natural compounds that have the ability to inhibit inflammation. It's one thing to say I'm going to take something that stops inflammation or at least reduces it. It's another thing to do that while you look for the triggers that drive the inflammatory cascade itself. In one case, you're just using natural compounds to do what medications do, which is shut down symptomatology without actually exploring and trying to modify the root cause. And so I think it's beneficial in the context of this discussion, if the goal is body recomposition, losing fat, gaining muscle, and we've already paid attention to things like setting your total calorie goals, prioritizing protein and making sure you're consuming enough to drive muscle protein synthesis, and then choosing your balance between carbohydrates and fat and minimizing carbohydrates to reduce your insulin levels, if that's an issue for you. The next thing that we have to think about is making sure that we're finding and fixing any cause of systemic inflammation, because what inflammation does, if you will recall, is it increases lipogenesis, that is adding body fat, and it decreases lipolysis, which is breaking fat down for fuel. And that's exactly what we want. When we want to lose weight, lose body fat particularly, we want to increase lipogenesis. And there's several different ways to do it. The problem is sometimes when you go in blindly, you don't know what's causing the problem. And so you have this kind of shotgun or scattered approach, and you try things and some things work, some things don't, some things work for a while, then you get stuck, some things a little bit, and they, beyond that, you're just kind of like, well, I don't know what to do next. So you have to start looking for inflammatory triggers, and there are many. And so we're just going to go through a quick list of what the most common inflammatory triggers are, with maybe a comment or two here along the way. But the reality is each of the 15 or so things that I have on this list could probably be its own episode or a series of episodes, which we might consider doing that at some time in the future. So what are the most common things? Well, I've talked a couple of times about how systemic inflammation sometimes can be part of an autoimmune reactivity. The most common form of autoimmune disease is Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, but it doesn't really matter what tissue or system is involved in an autoimmunity, whether it's thyroid issues or say something like MS in the brain, or if it's cartilage in your joints or type 1 diabetes in your pancreas. It doesn't really matter. Autoimmunity is autoimmunity, and it by definition is a systemically inflammatory condition. So if you have an autoimmune disease, sometimes you don't have to look any further than the fact that you have an autoimmune disease. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have other triggers for inflammation that might be stalling or sabotaging your weight loss efforts. You have to look for other things. We've already talked a little bit about food and diet, and I think most people understand these days, even though they don't necessarily take action on it, that the standard American diet itself is pro-inflammatory. And that is because some foods by nature are pro-inflammatory, and things that are certainly high sugar combined with high industrial fat tend to promote a lot of inflammation. But we talked early on a couple of episodes ago about things like lectins and nightshade vegetables and the potential impact for some people of things like nuts and seeds. And we talked about grains, which also tend to be pro-inflammatory. Food sensitivities are another issue. You might be eating foods that for most purposes are generally healthy. Like you can be allergic or sensitive to not just things like gluten, dairy, peanuts, eggs, shellfish, and soy, which are the big six, so to speak. You could be reacting to kale. You can have an immune response to kale or turmeric. You might be taking turmeric as an anti-inflammatory compound, not knowing that you're actually promoting inflammation because you have an immune response to turmeric or curcumin. And so any food has a protein structure. Even plant-based compounds and fat compounds actually have a protein structure to them. Something doesn't have to be an animal protein to have protein in it. And so any food you eat, you can potentially be sensitive to. And people tend to develop sensitivities to foods that they eat most often and in the highest amounts, particularly during periods of time where they're stressed and they're fatigued or they're sick with something else. The other issue as it relates to inflammation is, going back to one of the early episodes, we talked about gut health and things like leaky gut. But any type of gut infection or shift in the microbiome, any type of dysbiosis in the gut can drive inflammation. And a lot of times what happens with those conditions, when you shift your microbiome and your probiotic environment goes down, you lose some of the things that the microbiome does for you. For example, one of the things that a healthy microbiome does for you is to create these compounds called short-chain fatty acids, things like butyrate or propionate or acetic acid, and or acetate, I should say. And these short-chain fatty acids have local as well as systemic anti-inflammatory compounds. And so when we get into the gut, whether it's I'm eating foods that I'm reacting to and causing inflammation, or if it's I have an infection, or I've shifted my microbiome and I've lost my short-chain fatty acid production, all of these tend to drive local as well as systemic inflammation. We talked a little bit about leaky gut. I'm not going to go back into that again. Leaky gut causes systemic inflammation as well. But then we have other very common things like blood sugar imbalances. A couple of episodes ago, we talked about not tolerating low-carb diets and how that quite often is rooted in something called reactive hypoglycemia. Well, that's only one type of blood sugar pattern. We have other types like hyperinsulinemia, we have early insulin resistance, we have metabolic syndrome, all the way up to full-blown type 2 diabetes. And so blood sugar control is a spectrum. And sometimes paradoxically, at least it seems paradoxical, you can actually have what we call a mixed dysglycemia, where you have elements of high blood sugar and low blood sugar at the same time. And we'll perhaps explain that in a different discussion. Poor sleep. We have plenty of studies that show that one night of sleep actually increases your insulin resistance for a period of 18 to 24 hours, but also puts you into a pro-inflammatory state. And that's primarily because during the nocturnal period when you're sleeping, typically between the periods of 2 o'clock at night and about 5 o'clock in the morning, there's this kind of switch in the profile and the pattern, let's call it a dance, if you will, between anti-inflammatory hormones and pro-inflammatory hormones, so that while you're sleeping, as long as you're sleeping well, your immune system basically resets itself to prepare for the next day. And when that doesn't happen, you carry your inflammatory load from the day before into the next day. And so with poor sleep, you tend to be more inflamed on an ongoing basis. Then we have stress and stress chemistry. And stress is one of those funky words that kind of carries a lot of baggage. We tend to pigeonhole the word stress into the emotional stuff. Like I'm stressed because I had an argument with my spouse. I'm stressed because the economy sucks and everyone's sick, or everyone wants to, wear a mask, or I don't want to wear a mask and I want to wear a mask, or whatever the case might be. All of this kind of mental anguish. But the whole psychological aspect of stress is only one element. There's physical stress as well. That could be head concussion, it could be injury, or it could be being in the gym, exercising too much in your effort to lose weight. You're just thinking, well, if I just work out harder and work out more, I'm going to start to see the pounds come off and the inches come off. And at some point, you actually get into what we call an overreaching state, where you're starting to actually use exercise to promote more inflammation and more oxidative stress. Sometimes the answer to losing weight more efficiently is to actually do less in the gym and not more, for that very reason. The other part of stress is the biological stress. And so we have kind of the psychological, we have the physical, and then we have the biological stress. And that would include things like things we talked about, having autoimmunity, having a leaky gut, having gut infections, having blood sugar imbalances, or having hormone imbalances. These all actually carry an inflammatory component to them. And then we have things like chronic infections. Epstein-Barr is probably the most well-known one. There are many others. Negative thought process, seeing the world half empty rather than half full, having hormonal imbalances I mentioned a while ago. And one of the more common ones, and we're starting to learn a lot more about this, is what your toxin load is, what your environmental burden is, and if that is particularly paired with poor detox capacity. I'm going to cut the list right there because that was like 10 minutes of just screaming through a list of the most common culprits. And as you can see, there is no shortage of things that can cause inflammation. If you're just starting out in your process and you're starting to understand the idea that inflammation could be sabotaging your best efforts in terms of your diet and your exercise program, and you have to look for reasons you're inflamed, there's no shortage of things to look at. You just need to know where to look, how to recognize the symptomatology, or partner with somebody who actually knows how to walk through that process. But let me remind you of one thing. There's a lot of talk out there on the internet and health food stores, blogs, podcasts, where people talk about, oh, take this compound, take this herb, take this natural compound because it's anti-inflammatory. And that's all well and good, but it really in the end avails you nothing if you're not trying to find the triggers and change those. Now, in the next discussion, we're going to talk about how and why all of these triggers cause inflammation. Where do they converge, and how does inflammation actually happen? It's going to get a little geeky, it's going to get a little bit sciencey, but I think if you stick with me, there'll be a payoff as we continue to build your understanding of inflammation and what you can do to improve your body composition. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.